Hi and welcome to episode 5 of Mind the Gap, Varan Performance's podcast series, where we talk to business and thought leaders focusing on the gaps they're facing in the HR and finance and back office world between what they want to be doing and what they are doing. So really understanding how we should be approaching the post-pandemic world and how we conquer and work with and work towards meeting any gaps between what we want to do and how to do it. Today, I'm delighted to be welcomed by Kerry Nutley, who is the strategy director to discuss the Minding the Gap in efficiency and effectiveness and growth. Kerry, welcome. I know you were HR's most influential thinker of 2021. And
I know.
Welcome. Tell us about your role.
Yeah, so obviously super proud about the nomination from the industry for the 2021 Strategic Thinker, and that really is my job. So I have probably a fantastic, enviable job of thinking about how do people change and technology, what's the key trends and what does that really mean? So how do we translate what we see in the market, and then how do we as HR practitioners then translate that into helping our organisations and supporting our employees through it. So we obviously did a lot of work around the pandemic and just really trying to understand what that meant, because sometimes we can feel overwhelmed with economic and worldwide changes, but when we can chew that elephant down and try and break it down into manageable points, that's what my job is, to really try and help our customers here at Oracle think, well, what do I do next? How do I manage this proactively rather than reactively where we can?
And being in mid-market, you have a lot of customers, I imagine.
Yeah, we do. And I think that's absolutely lovely, because I remember once on LinkedIn, someone wrote to me from the HR department and said, the HR director said, why is it always big customers? Why is it all like the ways the Coca-Colas, the Hiltons that's on thought leadership? And that's completely right. So I made the decision to kind of move, we call it mid-market, but it isn't, it's large corporates. And I think, to me, it's lonely at the top, and it's more lonely in kind of areas like HR, because we can't discuss a lot of these things with our colleagues. And therefore, being able to connect through communities and these types of calls just to share good practice, but also to make sure that we know that what we're doing is right, because other people like us are doing us, gives us more confidence and capability in the jobs we do. So I think the more we can come together as a community, discuss it, because the world is very different to 2 years ago. There is no blueprint. We're kind of forcing our way forward with people wanting different ways of working, multiple generations in the workforce, kind of segmentating individual employee needs really down to ones or twos, especially with kind of requirements and where and how people work. I think it's just important that we stick together in terms of great practice, but also sharing, caring, and keeping our own sanity sometimes.
Brilliant. Okay, so we'll talk about some of those themes as we go through. Let me just finish the introduction, and then we'll get on to the first thoughts. So the accompanying this podcast is an article which Kerry and I have produced and worked on, which is called ERP and HR Systems, the 21st Century Revolution. That reflects really on the creation of best technology, the birth of Oracle and the other big ERP providers, and kind of thoughts and our look backwards, really, and what lessons there are in the future. Today, we're going to be focusing very much on what are the challenges which we're seeing over the next year or two, and how we as HR leaders and HR professionals could best start thinking about how to tackle those, both on a personal level and a team level, but also at a technology level. So, and finally, I'm Tom Holmes, founding director of Varan Performance, kind of thought leader in these areas. And as many of you know, I've been doing these podcasts now for many months, for some years. So I'm delighted that we're going to start. So Kerry, and thank you everyone for joining us. Please remember to use the Q&A box to ask your questions, and of course the chat function to share any thoughts or comments. So Kerry, topic one, the first thought is reflecting on the new conditions there's what I'm seeing is with inflation and interest rates combined, leading to, I suppose, a cost of money for many of our organizations pushing over 15% now. There's a real renewed push for efficiency, effectiveness, and possibly cost reductions behind that. But really, we're going back to a world where leanness and efficiency and effectiveness is becoming number one. What are your thoughts on that? And what are you hearing in the markets about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely. So, you only have to put on the news or, even put our shopping bills in. The cost of living is generally getting more expensive with the socio-economic political situation, with COVID, general unrest. We're really having to look at the bottom line in terms of cost, inflation, and all these other elements. And obviously with the majority of organisations where 70% of our workforce is people costs, and that we've also, on top of that, potentially got a growth in digital capability, key core skills, and even areas which predominantly had, a wealth of population in the employment, like hospitality. People now are finding that very difficult to recruit into these roles, which potentially may have been impacted by COVID, which employees may see at risk. We're kind of finding ourselves in HR this balance of increased costs in the business, the need to be more efficient and effective, whilst potentially in some skills an increased rise in kind of reward. And therefore with HR, it's how do we get this balance? But I know, Tom, from the work that you do both in kind of ERP and HCM, you're obviously speaking to customers as well as we are about how they're looking about not only driving efficiencies in their best business, looking at where they can reduce costs, but also, making sure as a brand they have that employee brand that's desirable with a clear purpose to make sure that they're only retaining talent, but attracting talent as well. I mean, I know we've been talking about it before in terms of what you're seeing.
Yes, I mean, what I reflect upon is how this is something we haven't seen with such importance for almost 20 years. So to be honest, many industries over the last few years have been working where labour pools and the ability of attracting talent quite cost effectively and in plentiful amounts has been the characteristic of much of the last 20 years. But if we go back beyond that, it was efficiency and effectiveness which was really driving stuff because of labour shortages, inflation, etc. And so for many of us in our careers, this is the first time we have been part of a cycle where people are really interested in getting absolutely the best out of all of their team members and colleagues. And I think as HR teams, we need to respond to this because we need to demonstrate the kind of efficiency and effectiveness and value for money, really, from our HR function, which the rest of our business has been asked to do. And, to be honest, although I know it's true in many industries where this has been a focus forever, this is new to many other industries, and I think it involves different ways of thinking, Kerry.
I think you're right. So, if you think about the various categories of employee generations in the workforce, my level of employment was around, what type of pension do I get? How much money am I going to get in the bank to pay my mortgage? Am I entitled to stocks and shares? Whereas, yesterday I went to an expo in Olympia on kind of small, medium startups and enterprise. And I was really taken back that hall was nearly a half of well-being offerings. And this is where we're really starting to see a shift in the employee proposition, the employee brand. And I think it's now with not only kind of people needing to clearly pay bills and clearly go for a reward package and that type of recognition, it has to be about that mix. And, yes, we need to attract talent, but in terms of this total reward package, you just can't offer, these incremental elements to some people. I think organisations as a whole are just thinking across the piece, not just large enterprises, but things like well-being is becoming more of a must-have to not only retain people in the business, but also attract people. Because what we're seeing is possibly maybe 1-2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, it was like a nice to have, maybe like the Googles and the big IT companies that were changing this. But now it's kind of a must have, both in terms of supporting people with COVID and managing the well-being through that. But again, people have come from different companies, and it now becomes a kind of things that people are just generally expecting in terms of how are organisations providing both a kind of monetary reward, but also a kind of wider employee offering and experience as well. And I think it's dealing with this with efficiencies and costs and everything. How do you get this balance? And I think this is a really big challenge for HR at the moment in terms of where do they invest, where do they look for efficiencies, and how do they try and make sure, as you said, they're maximising every element of the kind of maturity model in HR to get the best for their employees, their employer, but also their customers.
So was the conference yesterday providers, people who were providing this kind of this other benefits other than
Yeah, so it was really interesting because I have never seen a hall personally in my career full of well-being providers, and that ranged from at the stream tech end, kind of virtual reality headwears that HR could send out, and on those you would see anything from kind of doing training for maybe health and safety, if you maybe in an oil rig and you wanted to prep people before they went onto site, to general well-being, kind of sitting in a virtual spa. And a lot of the well-being was obviously generating business cases off of reduction of lost days of service, so sick days, etc., to kind of what you would see maybe, you know, standard kind of massage capabilities or people that came to the office. But there was a plethora of people in the middle that was creating websites on the spectrum of well-being. So, you know, creating content and easy capability through apps, both on kind of diversity and inclusion, so people felt more included within the workforce. So creating video content to areas like neurodiversity that people could purchase, all the way to kind of mental health management and where people go for help. So very much kind of take the app from them, small license fees, to probably companies like Calm that we saw in the pandemic, really taking a forefront where businesses were buying licenses for employees to give them the extra capability if they needed to find that. And I think if I think back to Oracle's AI at Work survey, we strongly found globally that employees were more willing to go to an app or speak to some form of technology to get support and well-being, especially if it was personal, than maybe going to an HR or a manager, because people wanted to self-serve on this, get information first, or to manage well-being locally before maybe speaking to a manager. And I think that was last year. But I would say, I think just generally people are becoming more open and honest about well-being. It's not a taboo subject anymore. I think COVID's kind of pushed that to the forefront. And I hope that very much is a trend we see moving forward, that it is something we can talk about. It is something that managers feel that they're capable and informed to talk about and that people can bring forward. But I think we are on that transitionary kind of path as people get comfortable, and maybe that difference in different industries, different genders, etc.
I guess what's one of the obvious characteristics, or obvious when we say it, is that the kind of investment in those kind of well-being things and our employees has a double benefit. It's a way of supporting them and retaining them, which isn't simply a money-related payment. So it's not simply just, I'm going to increase by this amount and that amount. So it's helpful on that sense to the overall businesses who are investing in this. But secondarily, it makes more people more able to work and work more happily and presumably more productively as well, Kerry. So it's kind of, not to make it too obvious, but giving people, just simply increasing people's salary, they can go and do things which are not necessarily beneficial to their well-being, etc., and also their ability to do great work. Whereas actually a well-being investment from firms does both of those things.
It does. And I think, I think pre-COVID, it was maybe a nice to have. It was maybe a differentiator, and I think it's becoming a must-have. I think in the next 2 to 3 years, it's going to be a kind of given for many medium to large enterprises, and even smaller organizations. And this was like a startup company. It's something that people are considering up front, whether that's flexible working, part-time working, side shuffles, the ability to be flexible around holiday, these type of smaller things, all the way up to IVR training and massages in the office, or whatever that might be. I think this is a thing that I think from working from home, people are kind of saying it's not just the probably the 6:30 to 5-6 p.m. commute anymore. People want a better quality of life in terms of work-life balance. And I remember watching Tomorrow's World, and they said connected mobile technology and the ability to get access to data at any time would give us all this free time. And I think we've probably seen the extreme where we've worked in periods where we've always been connected to work. And I think now we're saying, look, enough. We want to go back to that balance of being connected to work, being empowered to when we want to work, and having the tools to do that, but also making sure we have the right shut off, because otherwise we'll just burn out. And nobody wants that in terms of either managers, employees, or customers, because you want to keep quality people happy, healthy, in work, productive, moving forward. And I think that's part of the P&L. Hard to qualify, but obviously a good way in terms of generating those business cases is looking at your absenteeism and how can you reduce this. And I think we're starting to get some really good statistics through on well-being and health, and I know your organisations helps customers with that in terms of looking at how we can get these things to bring that kind of paradox of reduction of cost but improvement in well-being, in terms of not only employee satisfaction but bottom line and P&L productivity as well.
I'm going to come back on that in a second, but I'm just going to provide an explanatory note to some of our viewers. Tomorrow's World was used to broadcast what the world was going to look like in 20 or 30 years' time. And I think it might have stopped a little time ago, Kerry. So. Now, I did want to pick up on that, though. That's really interesting, because what you're describing is that, you see, these, or rather, let me explain it better. To measure these, to drive these things, we've got to measure them.
Correct.
So the issue is that if we're using more oblique and less direct methods to influence the retention and happiness of our staff, etc., we need better techniques to be able to measure their impact. And that, I'm an old style accountant. If you can't measure it, then you can't deliver it. So what are your thoughts on that, Kerry? Because I think it's kind of true, isn't it?
It is. I mean, I think that's definitely true. I think we as HR have got better at that. I mean, I know when I started my career, you would take a business case on, training, a big investment in leadership or whatever, and it was really hard to quantify. And you would kind of come up with some targets and go, well, we think it will be this, more people will make their objectives, but it was really hard to quantify. And I think now we're getting better at it. So we're especially supporting customers around the kind of usage of systems in terms of how employees are looking for data, looking for answers, cost of managing. So, for example, if I look at an HR help desk, you can see what type of tickets are coming through. You can see, if I have many questions asking the same, if I can then instantly that evening go in, change that FAQ or add that FAQ into the kind of HR help desk, move that to the front if maybe, I'm getting a lot of holiday requests around June in terms of how do I book this, how do I book that? There are seasonality in some of the questions that we see around pay review, bonuses around end of the financial year or whenever that happens. Just being more proactive using data, AI and analytics. Not only can you see where your costs are happening within your HR function, but you can also mitigate that and manage that better. So not only driving more efficiency, But the most important thing that I love, it empowers your HR team to do stuff which has more value. So rather than, constantly taking up paid time, the same questions, the same phone calls, you can put those down to a self-serve type model, maybe even using a chat bot if people are kind of, like me, might just go, well, I'll just ask someone because that's quicker. And then maybe obviously then freeing up our people to do the value added stuff, maybe the more personal stuff that we need to deal with only a human can do. And I think it's HR taking a proactive view and a holistic view of where are they getting asked for support, how can they proactively manage that in a most cost-effective way in terms of multiple channels to help people to try and make sure that we're using people for people value-added strategic work, and where we need to offer empathy at the first point.
Right. And in a world where the success or otherwise of our organizations is based around driving well-being, driving attraction, keeping people and retaining people, and I see stats where they are talking about 60% of retention decisions are based around the way they feel connected to people, to their business. It is in that context absolutely intolerable that our HR teams are wasting their time doing repetitive questions which are simply pushing a process through which is very basic. We've had tools which can tackle that stuff for years now, and getting people off doing that repetitive stuff and onto this more value-added stuff is absolutely critical, right, Kerry? Because there's 60% of decision making made about stuff other than what the business does, etc., but more about how well they're supported and how they're connected to it, means this is critical frontline stuff.
Yeah, I would definitely agree, because often we talk about retention, and I always use the term with our HR about being cobbler's children. We focus outwards and then we focus about ourselves. And I think, we need to, let's be honest about it. HR as a function, HR individuals have done an awesome job, carrying organizations, employing through COVID. And I think we need to start putting ourselves first to make sure we're offering premium service, but we're also making sure we're offering premium employee experience for our own staff and career capability as well. And I think, this type of technology, whether it's chatbots, Call Me, FAQs, AI in terms of asking questions, has been in the customer facing contact centers for years. The cost proof points in these things have come down considerably, and I think we should all be using these types of technologies, whether it's help desk capabilities, whether it's dashboards or reporting, out into the organization. And I think the other thing that we need to be doing as well is thinking about autonomy. So, often when we speak to customers, we're seeing that maybe, they've bought a HR system, but there's still a requirement to send decision making maybe around payroll or recruitment to a back office HR function to sign that off. These type of technologies are slightly out of date. It's how do we empower managers within the organization to work within an HR framework, within a kind of digital environment that they can choose. If this person needs a pay increase and they have the budgets within the pay framework, that they can click and make those decisions, rather than kind of having what we used to call the policing of HR. We need to move as a function away from policing these small kind of admin activities, empower the organization to take responsibility for their teams. At the end of the day, we're paying managers good money, or budget holders good money. Let's empower them, and then think about how we offer more value-added activities in terms of forecasting, strategy, improve productivity, simplicity, and policy to keep our organizations safe. But also think about that employee experience. How do we make it wow? How do we bring people in to do that?
So we've talked quite a lot about the push number one, which is greater efficiency, effectiveness, and the need for us to be focusing not on the basic administration of staff anymore, because that's just that's crazy waste of scarce resources. And so making that efficiency efficient is a duty of us, particularly in inflationary times. But the second element I'm seeing, which inflationary and the high interest rates are driving, is a push for all departments and all activities to be leading to driving growth. And what I've seen in the front office of businesses is that the digital transformation of services have completely transformed the way a business can grow and deliver its services. I was reflecting on this the other day. Even my timber yard, I can go and order stuff online. Then I can decide whether I want it collected, want it delivered tomorrow morning, tomorrow afternoon, the next day, the day after, or whatever, at different price points, or whether I want to click and collect. And it tells me when I'm ready. And that is not the most modern of retail experiences. A timber yard, for goodness sake. And yet, how many of us have got those kind of services driving the same level of digitally transformed stuff for our employees? I mean, Kerry, you know better than I do. How many of us do? What's going on there? Because either the tools are rubbish and we're not using them, or they're there and we're failing to actually deploy them. What's the story?
I never had you down as a secret carpenter, but we learn about every time we meet when we listen. So yeah, I mean, I remember probably 4 or 5 years ago with Procter & Gamble, looking at employee moments of truth. And I started my career way too many years ago. I mean, I talked about Tor as well, so you probably guess how old I am, looking at customer moments of truth. And this is now rippling through. So we know that happy employees equal happy customer experiences. We know that. And we can talk about the benefits in terms of retention, quality of service, customer satisfaction. And so now what we're seeing very much is this kind of same level of commercial capability hitting in the HR area. So savvy organizations are thinking about the employee experience, from attraction all the way to being a happy leaver, and now potentially alumni, because we know that actually the best recruiters are potentially the people that have left or those that are in our organization. So basically what we're saying is, what are those key touch points within an employee's career? How do we manage that? But then how can we get our systems and solutions to manage those forward? So we know that people will come in, they'll need some onboarding, they may want to go on paternity leave, they need to book their holiday, they need to get their equipment. How can we make that seamless? How can we make that easy? How can we even put that in their preferred language if English is not their preferred language? And so all of these things are coming into play. Some of the technology that we do also support people with neurodiversity. The reason that we offer text to speech and speech to text is because some people, have sight issues or hearing issues. And so all of these things about how we manage to the individual, but in a structured way so we can deal with one and many, is something that, forward-thinking HR departments are considering when they're looking at their CRM system. So the CRM system is not only there to support their HR function, but it's also there to support the employee as well, to give that autonomy.
Right.
When people have autonomy, they feel super empowered to get on with their job and be successful.
Absolutely. And the tools and techniques, in my view, exist. My whole business, Varan, is created about driving digital transformation. For years, we've been taking the techniques used in the front office, where, the front office, which is selling stuff to customers, they know that if a cart is left alone for a few hours even, they'll lose the sale. If that they're not multi-channel in the way that they communicate to their customers, they will lose a sale. If they are not driving an experience where customers get helped at the time they need to be helped, even if they don't realize it themselves, they will lose a sale. And if they don't do all three of those things, they'll lose their business. And I'm seeing exactly the same thing on the HR side. Some of our clients, I was talking to one of our potential, non-client, but one of our network in law firms, and they were talking about their analysis of the touch points during a recruitment period, recruitment of fee earners, right? And they were finding that if they weren't on it with an immediate response in certain ones, and when they did reduce what had been a response time of kind of 4 or 5 days to basic queries during that recruitment period down to less than a day, they saw an uptick in the number of fee earners who they were able to hire. And that is, it's just criminal not doing that, given the investment required to get to the point of having that conversation. So actually being able to see percentage upticks in that after the enormous investment they put in attracting the person, having a conversation with the person, all that stuff, to then drop it for an administrative reason is just, crazy, right?
And I completely agree. I mean, we're seeing people come in because, they've got systems downtime at the weekend. But if you think about it, that's when the majority of people are applying for new roles and responsibilities. So, I think you need to be kind of savvy in terms of your systems availability, the process from start to finish. So how you're connecting. We know that LinkedIn is probably doing like at least 80% of most of the recruitment these days, such a shift from where we were like 10, 12 years ago. We know that 62% of people, if probably now higher post-COVID, accessing job adverts through their mobile phone. And so it is that entire experience. And it's not as people start and sign their contract, but it's way up front. And things like Glassdoor, we all know this, but that's causing a perception in terms of how people perceive us. And that's about how people exit the business, and do they exit happy? Because that's kind of going to be really driving those statistics as well. And I think it's just one of those things that as HR, our job's just not from contract, start to finish. Our job is much more in terms of employee experience before we.
And I think that the best way of understanding this, the best way of tackling this, is actually by looking at looking at these problems as a digital transformation exercise. I can't overstate how this has been going on the customer sales end for years, and the techniques are there. I mean, as I said, our whole business is about applying the techniques you use on a customer to your internal team, and coming out with analyzing carefully, as if they were customers, what the experience is. And it's incredibly humbling and exciting, actually, because it really does. It's kind of, I see why those people are complaining about their experience. It's kind of like, it's quite obvious, just like revelations we've seen on the customer side as people have digitalized their services, etc.
And I think you're right. I mean, my passion in HR, that I am the freaky HR person that likes Excel spreadsheets and workforce management. And I wrote a piece around workforce management in the future, and how scenario-based planning has been impacted by COVID. What we just use for workforce management is changing that, and how HR is becoming the super job. Because as practitioners, we have to be the marketeers, we have to be the salespeople, we have to be the operations manager, we have to be the compliance manager and the escalation manager, and we are becoming this super role. So as we're moving to higher valued roles, we are having to have a plethora of these skills, because you're right, we're doing the marketing job and positioning our brand up front to attract people. We're dealing with the escalations. We're becoming, managing negotiations, whether that's through, settlement agreements or whatever. And so the skill set that we're looking for as we move the kind of how much total labor cost and total labor resource do I have on an Excel spreadsheet, as things like our dashboards are able to manage that for us in a much more effective way, we're having better quality conversations, but we're growing in skills and capability as well. And it's an amazing when you sit down and think about, oh my goodness, I just did that, or what I did for the last quarter, how many different capabilities that we use as HR.
Yeah, and that's a really good article. So what I'll do is we'll post out a link to that one as well, Kerry. I mean, it wasn't my job writing those kind of things, but that one's definitely, that means 2 pieces of reading material for our audience today, which we'll post out. So plenty to do after. Now, so Kerry, you've been talking about that link to finance and how that actually empowers HR to do more and better future forecasting. So can you tell us a bit more about that? So, it's kind of like we've talked about this for decades, right? So
Yeah.
what's the latest? How should we be
Yeah, I
approaching that
mean,
as teams?
you know, pre-COVID, I had Peter Cheese and Rebecca McCarthy, the CIPD and CMA, talk about, you know, finance are from Mars and HR are from Venus. And it was, I mean, we always kind of had this piece that, you know, we loved our finance colleagues, but we kind of had this kind of healthy friction with them because they would be trying to reduce our budgets, but we were saying, no, this people needed to be there from a health and safety or business growth perspective. Likewise, we were very protective of kind of data because we have got the kind of capacity to hold that sensitivity data, and we need to make sure we manage that. And I think, you know, how many times have we changed a forecast of resourcing that, you know, if you leave it too long, your budget for the end of the year, your total labour cost is kind of way over, and you're thinking, how did that happen? Because you're not seeing the same numbers. And I think, you know, if we think about when we did day in the life of a BT before we implemented our CRM system, we were finding that workforce management activities was taking up 60% of our HR managers' times in terms of either processing, leavers, joiners, budget management with finance. And the great thing is now with the automation, that's reduced so we can spend our time doing other things. But it's about having that connectivity with finance. It's about integrating our HR systems with our finance systems. So, you know, if we focus on just having a standalone capability in terms of our data for HR, it's only us seeing that. So we're really not driving the super efficiency that we could be getting. What we should be looking for is a one single source of the truth of the data. So then we're having a higher value conversation rather than still on the old adage, I don't recognize that number. Because as soon as you're in that I don't recognize that number conversation, the conversation has to stop until you've reconciled that data to then have the quality of conversation. And that takes time. I know I've been there half a day, you know, every quarter, double checking numbers with finance, line by line, person by person. But that really we need to say goodbye to, because there's more things we're being asked to do by our organisations, by the people we support, and we should be putting that to a system capability and moving ourselves forward to this type of well-being, employment proposition, branding that we know we can excel at. And I think, you know, connecting ourselves with finance by getting the data source as one truth really helps those relationships, and having a quality conversations about why we need people in certain roles doing certain things, but also forecasting forward. So we know that the world is not the same that we work in, and therefore we should be looking now, and if anything COVID taught us was, you know, business continuity can't be left now to maybe once a year or once a quarter. Being aware of what the opportunities may or may not be, how can we future forecast those, and how can we adapt to our business, whether that's a change in skill set, maybe that's a change in location, maybe as we move from a kind of remote working to hybrid working, potentially moving more back to offices or a fixed place to work. These are the things that we should be using our time with, rather than just looking at total labour cost, total labour resource, because that's what we should definitely be leaving to that 60% to our systems to do it for us.
Very interesting, Kerry. And what if you had one piece of advice to your I imagine you're handing out advice and receiving advice from your customers all the time. So what's the piece of advice or pieces of advice which are really ringing true at the moment and which you're hearing a lot?
I mean, I would always say to the customers, you know, be clear on the ambition or vision that you want to achieve. And then I think the piece of advice is then break that down to the achievable steps to get there. And I think you should always set an end goal. You might have to do that in phases or releases. In our world, obviously it's releases, but you have to be clear on where you want to get to, because what we're finding is kind of adding knee-jerk fixes to activities just means that your costs continue to go up. I think it's a good idea to have a look at the ambition, be clear on the outcome you want to get to, and then work towards that, rather than constantly adding sticky tape. Because what you'll find, if you just bolt things together, you're going to have increased complexity, potentially an increased set of skills or a set of resources that you need to manage
Kerry,
those.
that is really interesting. I'd like to pick up on that.
Okay.
The number of times I will go to an HRD and say, what are you up to? And then where do I start? 20 different initiatives, 10 different things happening here, 4 different things. I'm trying to tackle this, I'm trying to tackle that, I'm trying to tackle the third thing. What you just said kind of made me contrast that with my similar conversations with sales directors and people who are driving that part of the outward facing of the business. And typically the thing is, I will hear is, I am doing 2 things. I am modernizing this, I'm driving that product or that service or whatever it is. And that contrast, to me, it's kind of like a kind of penny drop moment as to how that can't be right, the long list of 20 or 30 things. It's got to be, it should sound more like what you hear from the sales and marketing side, where it may be only 1 or 2 big thrust, big message things.
Yeah, I mean, I learned this capability when I was at Deloitte, and I was lucky to be working on a project with a change consultant. That was his full-time job. I never heard of a change consultant before, but I think, as people, we have a capacity to absorb change, and sometimes by doing everything doesn't get you a higher outcome, because it's the old adage of seeing the wood through the trees. So I think as HR, as a central function, it's about how can we enable the business to absorb the changes in a quality, high outcome way, in addition to their day job, because they've got other activities they're doing locally, to get the right return. And that's sometimes not filling the hopper of change activities so it's full, so we look busy and we can show we've completed a set of activities, because I think, to me, it's not the doing, it's the outcome.
Right.
And so it's that kind of old thing, so that to me would be the kind of focus. What's the outcome you want to achieve? Where's the end game that you want to get to? Clearly plans change, but it'd be clear on the vision and the outcome and the core KPIs, and make sure it's only 3, 4 or 5. You don't want to plethora of HR outcomes. If you get the right input, you'll get the right outcome.
Yes, organise the initiatives and activities, which may be a large number, but actually they are contributing to only 2 or 3 outcomes if they're well organised. And then it's the outcomes you're talking about and how those things contribute to that outcome, allowing you then to organise each of those activities directed at a specific outcome, but most critically, measure their success against that outcome, not in themselves, but how have they driven or made a uptick on recruitment or retention or whatever. And that, as you say, involves that joint back to the finance system, so that there's financial meaning to each of those outcomes as well as people meaning.
Indeed. Couldn't have said it better.
I'm really excited about our conversation today. I thought it was really fascinating. We've got the 2 articles which I'd like to direct everybody to, which are going to be published. And my overall thought from what you're telling me, Kerry, though, my takeaway is that there's a lot of comparison of HR with finance and kind of like joining it up and all that stuff, as if it were comparable. But what I think the new conditions are doing is it's moving a lot of the HR activities from back office with finance, etc., into front office. Successful businesses under these conditions, treating their HR retention, their staff, as importantly as their customers. And that connection is really interesting. Most companies believe that their staff, their happiness, their well-being, and their ability to deliver is as important as their customers' health, happiness, and well-being. And that's a fascinating change, right? And that's driven by COVID, inflation, other pressures which we're seeing in the world.
Indeed. I mean, and I think if you think back to some of the brands that have been saying this for a long time, like Virgin, the ones that you always aspire to be, they had that formula. And now I think the rest of us are just catching up. We knew it was right, but how to do it and how to do it well. And it's great that I think that we are thinking about this, that it's a conversation we can have at the boardroom, and it's a conversation that all functions of a business want to do and want to execute on, and it's getting the priority it should have. So it's not just HR now ringing the bell. We've kind of been there, done it. Unfortunately, we had to wear the t-shirt, and we're going to wear the impact of this, you know, for many quarters, years ahead. But actually what we've learned to be is more agile, more inclusive, and actually thinking about putting ourselves first and our employees first and our customers first, equally as well with profits and stuff for many organizations. Because I think, you know, if we don't maintain this focus on well-being, on the employee experience, and I don't think it's generational, because I think you can't just offer it to some people, it will get offered to everybody. I think you'll find that this will be the kind of change of work created by COVID, but hopefully having beneficial impact.
Yes, I think your point, it's for years, is true. This has been turbo powered by COVID, and what we knew was true but kind of were ignoring a couple of years ago is now turbo powered and is unignorable. And I think it's fascinating. I mean, who wants to travel by P&O ferries at the moment? It's kind of like the way they treat their staff matters more to their customers than ever before. And with that, I would like to thank you, Kerry, for joining me this morning. That was a really great talk, really enjoyed that. I hope, and thank everybody else in our audience for joining. I hope you enjoyed it and found it as useful as I did. Thanks for taking time out of your day and investing it on coming to join us, and please take a look at the articles which we're going to send out afterwards, because if nothing else, I think that they're going to generate a couple of really interesting insights and ideas which might help you in your work. So thank you very much, Kerry, and thank you everyone for joining.